Hello, this is Lafayette Faust, creator of the Nevermore Hollows podcast. Thank you for making the show a success. Please take a moment to subscribe, give 5 stars, comment, and share the show with your friends. It's the best way to help us grow and to be able to continue to provide quality horror content. Also, please support our new art director, Chris Madman Goins at Black Sheep Studios TN on Instagram. He has some amazing Nevermore Hollows art for sale, signed by the both of us, as well as many other original pieces I think you're going to love. Now, for you horror hounds who like to have a good laugh, I invite you to check out my other podcast. It's called The Three Uncool Cats. In it, my 2 friends and I sit in a basement and discuss music, movies, and whatever else comes into our warped minds. I would really appreciate it if you would give it a listen. Now, with that out of the way, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Maybe they were too naive to understand that seeking out the murder tree was a bad idea. Maybe they were mistakenly bespelled by their youth that they were invincible. Or maybe they were simply stupid. Either way, the 3 teenagers drove boldly through the countryside toward the old cemetery that was entombed 5 miles deep into Dunwich Forest. The legend of the murder tree was nearly 400 years old. The story went that on March 10th, 1659, twin girls named Gretchen and Dolly Crookbane had found a crow's nest in a tree while playing in the cemetery. The nest had 6 new hatchlings. The twins were said to have been wicked little girls, and they killed the baby birds for fun. That night, the girls disappeared from their home, and the next day, their skins were found hanging from the branches of the very tree that had held the crow's nest. It was widely believed that the mother crow had murdered the 2 girls in revenge for what they had done to her babies. The residents had begun calling the tree the murder tree, and that had stuck. Most people disregarded the story as nothing more than folklore, but others, like Calvin, Peyton, and Autumn, believed that the story was at least partially true. Calvin was in the driver's seat of the 1980 Bronco, carefully navigating the winding country road. He was 16, thin, and wore black-framed glasses. "Nevermore has 8 cemeteries," he said. "Tell me again why you think the murder tree is in this one?" Autumn was in the front passenger seat. She too was 16, and her blonde hair fell to her shoulders in 2 braids. "It's the first and oldest cemetery in the area," she replied. "And it's full of huge oak trees, so it kind of makes sense that we'd start our search there." Peyton sat in the back. She was only 15 and Calvin's cousin. She leaned forward between Calvin and Autumn. "So, Allison Bradford and her twin sister Amber went missing from town yesterday, and you think that it has something to do with the murder tree. Why?" Autumn turned in her seat to look at Peyton. "Okay, you already know the story of Gretchen and Dolly Crookbane, the twins that went missing in 1659, but my research shows that there were 2 more twin girls went missing on the same day in 1837. They were named Agatha and Jolene Barnum. The next day, Their skins were found hanging from the same tree. Peyton looked both shocked and skeptical. Well, I've never heard that part of the story. Why isn't that part of the legend? Autumn shrugged. Who knows? Stories evolve. Sometimes they gain erroneous information and sometimes they lose facts. Calvin was bookish, a math whiz, but not weak like most nerds. He was lean and strong. He quickly did the math in his head. Wait, if that's right, Agatha's and Jolene's murders happened 187 years after Gretchen and Dolly's. And today is exactly 187 years since Agatha's and Jolene's. Peyton's eyes shot wide. Autumn! What the heck, girl? Autumn rolled her eyes. Relax. You literally told me that you don't believe in the murder tree anyway. You said it was all a bunch of hokum. When we talked about this earlier, you didn't tell me that it looked like a pattern, Peyton said. This kind of thing seems like a curse. You got to keep in mind, black girls like me don't mess around with the supernatural like you crazy blonde girls do. Autumn narrowed her eyes at her best friend as if she were offended, but she couldn't stop her smile. Well, that's a bit racist to say. Peyton laughed. No, it's not. I said nothing about the color of your skin, only the color of your hair, and everybody knows that blondes be a bit cray. Touché, Autumn said. Blondes do have a reputation for being a bit whack, but here's the thing. I do think that the murder tree exists and that it's in this cemetery that we're headed toward. I do think that maybe it has something to do with Allison's and Amber's disappearance yesterday. There's a lot of people looking for them right now, but nobody is looking at their disappearance from a paranormal angle. Besides, you're a skeptic. What are you so worked up about? Peyton shook her head. Even skeptics are smart enough not to tempt fate. I agree that we shouldn't tempt fate, Calvin said. But I'm also devoted to reason. Everything has a rational explanation. Therefore, I don't think there is anything that we need to worry about. Okay then, Mr. Logic, Peyton replied. Although I may be a skeptic, I'm still open to the supernatural. How do you explain the pattern? Easy, Calvin said. It could be that the Crooksbane sisters were murdered by a settler gone mad, and that the Barnum sisters fell victim to a copycat murderer all those years ago. But that doesn't mean it was a curse or anything supernatural. Peyton wasn't convinced. What about the Bradford sisters? Twins gone missing on the anniversary of the first two murders, who just happened to have been of twins? That doesn't mean it's paranormal, Calvin shot back, only that it's either a coincidence or another copycat killer. They all rode in silence, reflecting on what Calvin had said, uncomfortable at his analysis, but also excited at the idea of adventure. The road was winding and took them deeper into the forest. Eventually, they arrived at a one-lane road that veered off from the county road. The cemetery is down this road, Autumn said. It sits behind an old church. Both were first in the area. The cemetery is still used to this day, but not the church. Though no services are held there, the town ensures its upkeep. You don't believe the stories that the church is haunted, do you? Calvin asked. Autumn shrugged. Not really sure I believe in that kind of stuff, but I do love a good scary story. And so do the both of you. That's why I thought it would be fun to come and see. If nothing else, maybe we can at least find the murder tree and prove it is more than a legend. Wouldn't that be cool? Calvin nodded. Yeah, it would. He turned off the county road and drove down the lane, eventually arriving at a small graveled lot next to the old church. He parked and they got out of the Bronco and took in the scene. The day had turned overcast and gray, muting the fiery colors of the fall foliage. A chilly breeze resurrected the fallen leaves, causing them to skitter around their feet like reanimated spiders. The stone church loomed over them, and the gravestones seemed to spread out forever before them. "This isn't ominous at all," Calvin said. Peyton cast a sideways look at him. "You feel that?" Calvin and Autumn nodded. "There's a strange energy here," Peyton said, "and it's too quiet, almost crypt-like." Calvin rolled his eyes. "Don't be so dramatic." "And I just thought of something," Peyton added. "We show up at a haunted cemetery to look for a thing called the murder tree, and we brought no weapons. We literally just showed up empty-handed." The weight of that observation settled over them like a burial shroud. After a moment, Autumn urged them on. "We better get started. Daylight is running out." She took off around the back of the church and into the sprawling cemetery. "There are a lot of trees in this graveyard. Let's spread out. Remember, the legend goes that on the anniversary of the first murders, the tree is supposed to have had a heartbeat." "Missing girls, trees with heartbeats," Peyton said. "I can't believe I agreed to do this." They spread out, Autumn in the middle, Calvin to her left, Peyton to her right. There were hundreds of gravestones, dozens of mausoleums, but there seemed to be uncountable trees. They slowly made their way, working toward the center of the cemetery. As they came upon a tree, one of them would put their ear against it and listen. If there was no heartbeat, they would move along to the next tree. "This is stupid," Calvin said. "I'm listening for a heartbeat in a tree, and I don't even believe in this kind of stuff." Amanda rolled her eyes and urged him forward. After an hour had passed with no result, Autumn called them over. "It's 4:00. Sunset is around 6. That gives us only 2 hours to find it. I hope we get lucky soon." Peyton glanced around the graveyard. "I already feel like we're surrounded by evil things. There's no way I'm staying here after dark." Calvin turned slowly, looking all around them. "This is ridiculous. There are too many trees. We need to narrow it down." "I'm open for suggestions," Autumn said, brushing away a strand of blonde hair from her forehead. Calvin continued to turn, taking in every tree within sight. "Maybe this wasn't the center 400 years ago," he said. "What do you mean?" Peyton asked. Calvin pointed toward the direction they had come. "Just over that hill is the church. We have walked in a straight line from the back of it." "Yes," Autumn said. "So?" "The graveyard has grown over the centuries," Calvin explained. What would have been the center 400 years ago may not be the center now, depending on which direction the new graves were added. Autumn's eyes widened in revelation. "Duh, that makes complete sense. So what we need to do is start looking for the oldest gravestones, then try to calculate the center from there." Calvin surveyed the land around them. After a moment, he stepped toward a group of smaller gravestones that were hard to read due to the exposure to time and the elements. "This one is dated 1800. He pointed east from where they were standing, and the gravestones in that direction look like they are getting older. And there's plenty of trees. Let's go that way." They made their way over a hill and saw a particularly massive live oak clawing toward the sky. Its leaves had passed the fiery stage of fall colors and were now mottled with death, though they had yet to fall to the ground. Most of the trees around here still have bright fall-colored leaves, Calvin said. But not that one. Autumn pulled her gaze from the twisted tree. What's up with its bark? It looks almost like alligator skin. Well, that has to be our tree, Calvin said. He glanced around. The sun had fallen below the treetops of the forest that surrounded them, further darkening the day. We're running out of time. They began walking toward the tree. As they got closer, they felt the temperature drop, and they also heard the faint thrum of a beating heart. They stopped and glanced nervously at each other. Calvin saw the wonder in the girl's eyes and knew that they could see the same in his. "Holy cow," Peyton said. "You hear that? So the story is true. How is it doing that?" Calvin was shaken, but not ready to give up on logic. The tree was creepy as hell, and the heartbeat coming from it seemed to sink to his own, making him feel anxious. But he mustered his courage and stepped under the dark shadows cast by the murder tree's long, groping limbs, which reminded him of giant black tentacles. "There has to be an explanation," he said. The girl stepped under the massive tree, also feeling its oppression. "It's definitely coming from inside the tree," Peyton said. Calvin had brought along a backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight. He removed the flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it up into the intertwining branches, looking for the source of the heartbeat. Even with the bright light, he was not able to see far due to the decaying leaves. He maneuvered around the trunk, looking from different angles. Autumn touched the tree's alligator-like bark. It felt unnaturally warm, and she snatched her hand back when she thought that the bark shivered at her touch. "I take it that didn't feel good?" Peyton said. Autumn grimaced and wiped her hand on her jeans. "No, I didn't like that. Maybe Peyton's right and we should just leave. This tree is wrong. It's just filled with darkness." "I think I see something up in the branches," Calvin said. He stepped closer, careful not to touch the bark. He moved the light toward a break in the serpentine branches. He shivered when the light illuminated Allison and Amber Bradford. Their ankles were bound to a branch, and they hung upside down, their long red hair intertwining with the scaly leaves. "Dear Lord," he said. "Oh my gosh," Peyton said. "That's them, the missing girls." Calvin pushed his shock aside. "We have to get them down." "But they look dead," Peyton said. "We need to call the sheriff." She took her phone from her pocket and said, "Crap! No service." Calvin and Autumn checked their phones. Neither of them had service. Calvin handed Peyton the flashlight. "We can't just leave them up there. Take this so that I can have both my hands free to climb up and get a closer look to see if they're even alive." Just as Calvin reached toward the lowest branch, an odd sound came from the woods surrounding the cemetery. It began as a nearly imperceptible susurration from deep within the darkling forest. "Are those voices?" Calvin said. "It's hard to tell," Peyton said. "I don't like this." "Hurry up and see if they're alive," Autumn said. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Calvin steadied himself and grabbed the lowest branch, grimacing at the fleshy feel of the bark, and pulled himself up into the tree. He could feel the tree's unnatural heartbeat pulse against his palms. The murmuring from the woods grew louder and closer. "Hurry, Calvin," Autumn said. She glanced over at Peyton, who was trying to stay focused on making sure Calvin had enough light to see, though she continuously glanced toward the voices in the forest. The sun was fully behind the towering trees that encircled them, and the lengthening shadows slithered across the graveyard. Suddenly, from the forest burst forth a vast black shape, flying 30 feet above the ground. It headed directly toward them with incredible speed. For a moment, Autumn wasn't sure what it was she was seeing. Then, as the shape flew closer, she realized that it was a massive flock of crows. Her stomach clenched when she remembered that a group of crows was called a murder. The murder flew at them like a 1,000-winged nightmare creature, all flapping out of sync, yet with a haunting cadence, as if they were keeping time with some demonic beat. And every single crow was whispering the same word in hateful unison: revenge. "Guys," Autumn said, "what is that?" Peyton glanced over her shoulder, and her eyes shot wide. "Oh, crap!" The murder darted low directly at them. As it flew around them, they could feel the temperature drop 10 more degrees, felt the air buffeted around them from the beating of the wings, and heard its promise stated over and over: revenge. Peyton threw up her hands as one of the crows broke free from the mass and swooped down at her, clearly trying to pull her attention from shining the light for Calvin. As she threw up her hands, the beam from the flashlight shot up into the black mass of crows. Where the light touched them, the crows squawked in anger, and the mass parted, as if it were the parting of the river Styx. "Do that again!" Autumn shouted. The flapping of the wings and the verbal repeating of their evil intent was so loud that Peyton barely heard her. But she understood and began shining the light all around them, temporarily keeping the murder from attacking. She glanced up at Calvin and saw that he was now close enough to Allison and Amber that he could check for signs of life. Rope secured their legs to a gnarled branch. As he reached toward them, they both jerked awake, eyes wide with fear and shock, and began screaming. Calvin was terrified but focused. He began speaking soothingly to them, trying to calm them as he began working at the knots of rope. He momentarily forgot that he had a pocket knife. He grabbed it and cut the terrified girls free. They scrambled down the tree, hit the ground, and all 5 of them began running back toward the Bronco. The murder attacked. Peyton dropped the flashlight. It rolled out of reach. The mass of crows swooped down upon them, clawing, scratching, pecking. Within seconds, they were all bruised and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. Suddenly, the murder swarmed Amber, completely obscuring her. Her screams began with terror and ended in a pain-filled shriek. The murder parted, leaving Amber standing before the others. Her skin had been completely removed from her body. She stood before them, a terrifying sight of raw meat and tendons. Her face was a gruesome, grinning mask. For a sickening heartbeat, she was still alive. Then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed to the ground, dead. Autumn and Peyton were crying. Calvin was shaking. Allison simply stood in shock. The mass of crows twirled up into the sky, carrying Amber's skin, and headed toward the murder tree. Calvin suddenly understood. "Go, go, go," he said. "They are going to come back for Allison's skin." Autumn and Peyton bolted for the Bronco. Calvin grabbed Allison by the arm and dragged her along with him. When they had made it to within 50 yards of the church and the Bronco, he hazarded a glance back. He saw that the crows had draped Amber's skin from one of the murder tree's branches. They swarmed back up into the sky, then shot directly toward them. He yelled at the girls to run faster. They shot past the church just as the murder fell upon them. They were buffeted by 1,000 wings, pecked with hundreds of beaks, scratched with dozens of claws. They made it to the Bronco, snatched open the doors, and Peyton and Autumn climbed inside and pulled Allison in behind them while Calvin crawled into the driver's seat. They slammed the doors shut. Luckily, none of the crows had gotten inside the Bronco, but they assaulted the vehicle with rage. It was difficult to hear above the cacophony of the squawking, the hammering, the pecking. Calvin fumbled the keys into the ignition, and the Bronco roared to life. He slammed into drive and tore off down the tree-lined lane away from the cemetery. The murder followed them, relentless in their attack. However, when Calvin roared out of the woods and onto the county road, the murder stopped following them and shot back toward the cemetery. For a while, they rode in silence, trying to process everything they had seen. Allison was in shock and continued to sob at the loss of her sister. She sat between Peyton and Autumn, and they held her, knowing that words would ring hollow. The sun had released its claim on the day, and night was in full rain when they drove past the Welcome to Nevermore sign at the edge of town. They made their way to the sheriff's department, where they were immediately taken to see Sheriff Mosley. To their surprise, Mosley did not question their sanity as they told their macabre story. In fact, it seemed as if he already knew that Nevermore Hollows was more mysterious and dangerous than it seemed. He sent deputies to the graveyard to recover Amber's body. Then he had an EMT look after Allison as he took their statements. Afterward, he called their parents, and while they waited, he told them that though they had been foolish to set off alone, he was impressed at their bravery and quick thinking under pressure. Then, before leaving them alone in a quiet room so they could console each other while they waited for their parents, he left them with a profound statement. "There is a spiritual realm," he said. "It is inhabited by evil entities, and they want to destroy you. Therefore, you must continue to fight."